Hi, welcome back to Onion Shop Joe. Today I want to talk about the older Select Plus, M11, N14. Doesn't really matter on what we're going to talk about. I was down at Jake's and he's got a new guy working for him, and he happens to have bought some older dump trucks, and one has a M11 Select and one has an N14 Select Plus. So he told me that he had overhauled the M11 because it had a little bit of blow by and it was missing at idle all the time. So he got all done, and the overhaul was a cylinder head and cylinder kits and the gaskets. He said the cylinder head was it was a Cummins Recon head, and I think his overhaul kit might have been IPD or something like that. I'm not sure, but anyway, then he got done and it ran good, but it had a miss at idle. So he took the injectors out and he took them up to a fuel shop and had them checked, and they said they're all okay. So I put them back in and he still has this miss at idle. So I said, well, does it miss off idle? When you're driving down the road, he goes, no, it seems to run fine, but he said this miss at idle is making me crazy. So uh, let me shift gears for a second. Back in probably 1991, when I was working at Cummins, and I was one of the people that worked on the newer stuff or field test, and they had me go outside and get a UPS cracker, yeah, UPS cracker box, because we had FedEx and UPS at the time, but it was UPS because it was the dark brown. And they said it's here for a miss. I started up, and man, this thing is knocking and is blowing out black puffs of smoke. It's the summertime. So I drive it in the shop, and I raise the cab up, and we didn't have heat guns then. So I used to burn my fingers all the time. So I would tap the exhaust ports to see which one was cold, which one was hot. And on this truck, I think it was number 3, it was firecracker hot, man. I mean, I just touched that thing quick and my fingers were burning. And number 6 was ice cold. So I put an injector in number 6, get all done, put the cab down, start it up, and it's knocking and blowing out black smoke. I raise the cab back up, I hook up in sight, and I'm doing cylinder cutouts, and I really can't tell what's going on. So I ended up calling the factory, and I go, hey, I said, da 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 da, because back then there was no online stuff. You called the factory. I had phone numbers, my little black book with phone numbers of engineers, and I called him, and the guy said, is there one that's really hot? And I said, oh yeah, number 3, man, it's hot. And he goes, replace number 3. And I go, why, man? It's running. It's running better than the rest of them. He says, that's precisely what's wrong. So he goes, and now this is what I wanted to tell you. He said, mind you, this is 1991. He said, on these ECMs, what happens is we can't control idle with the injectors because we can't, at current design, bring the amount of fuel we inject at idle down low enough to have the engine run at a nice smooth idle around 500 to 700 RPM. He said if every injector fired every time at idle, the engine would run at 1150 RPM. And I'm just listening, and he goes, so what we do is, he said, we tell the software to shut injectors off and keep shutting a different injector off every 720 degrees. So he said that's why those engines sound funky at idle. But when you rev them up, they sound smooth, like an old mechanical injector. He said at idle, they are actually constantly missing. And he said, if one of the injectors starts to fire a little too hard for some reason, a little too much fuel, because something happened inside of it that's causing that. He said it throws that idle algorithm off, and the engine will pick one injector and it'll shut it off every time, or it'll flop back and forth between two. And he said then immediately your ear picks up, oh, there's a miss in the engine. And you'll go in and you'll find the cold cylinder and you'll change it. But he said what you need to do, and I discovered this just from practice, is rev the engine up. If it sounds smooth when it revs up, then all the injectors are firing okay. Then what you got to do is go back to idle and look for the injector that's right before the miss in the firing order. And I used to do this on the N14s. Remember, they had those plugs on the side of the rocker box you could unplug to unplug the injector. I would unplug an injector that was running a little bit, I thought, hot, and see if the next one would come in and fire. And if it did, then I would change that injector. So some guys would come in and they would go, I want this thing to idle really smooth. And I saw many times people put like 6 injectors in and it idled worse than it did when we started. And I talked to an engineer in fueling, and he said, if you get one of these engines that runs smooth, he said, don't change anything on it, don't touch it. He said, you're a lucky guy. He said, they just don't idle or sound smooth. He said, but those engines weren't designed to be used at idle. They were designed to work. And he said, once they come off idle, they run good and they run smooth. So all that spun through my head when this guy's telling me about his M11. So what I said to him was this. I said, does it run good when you're pulling? He goes, oh, yeah. I said, does it run good when you're not at idle? He goes, oh, yeah, it runs smooth. I said, leave it alone, drive it, and go make money with it. There's nothing wrong with it. So that's a scoop on the Select Plus, and you heard it here on Engine Shop Joe. See you next time.